What a game. Man, Resident Evil 2. Wow. Okay, so like my God of War review, I'm really not going to be showing you much footage in this review because I don't want to spoil the experience for you. It's so littered with incredible moments and surprises that, like, to show off what makes this game so good is to spoil the game, and I don't want to do that. So I'm going to talk about the game, I'm going to show you some stuff, but I'm not going to show you the stuff that's really like, wow. So this is 1000% spoiler free, don't worry, you can watch this fully safe, and if you want to be extra safe, and you don't want to even see any enemy types or whatever, just listen to the review, that's it, that'll be fine. But yeah, man, what a game. So there are really two pillars to this game's greatness, the nostalgia factor and also its modernity. Much like God of War, it takes something deeply familiar and revitalizes it in a way that feels like loving homage while also feeling like truly avant-garde design. So let's start with understanding the significance of Resident Evil 2 and why they've bothered to remake this game. I remember playing Resident Evil 1 near its release, and it was a fantastic game. It really birthed the survival horror genre as we know it today. There were survival horror games before this, but Resident Evil was the one that went absolutely gangbusters and established a whole bunch of tropes that survive to this day. The puzzle focus, the disempowered combat, the narrative drama, all of this combined in a way that no one had really seen before, and Resident Evil became this immediate smash. That game was released in 1996, and Resident Evil 2 was released 2 years later in 1998. I cannot put into words how much of a leap Resident Evil 2 was over its predecessor, and it was a leap that no one really thought would be possible. It was like Halo 2 over Halo 1, or GTA Vice City over GTA 3, or Diablo 2 over Diablo 1. All of these original games were genius, but their sequels managed to surpass their genius in a way that is so rare for a sequel to do. Resident Evil 2 took the idea of a haunted mansion and spilled it out onto the streets of a fictitious Raccoon City in a similar way that Arkham City did over Arkham Asylum. It was the same brilliant gameplay applied to a different template, and with a bigger budget and with a better story and better graphics, but it really wasn't those things that made it better than its predecessor. It just had an X factor to it that no one can really put their finger on. It's like with Vice City. We all know that Vice City is better than GTA 3, but if someone was to ask us why, we'd be like, I don't know, it just is. So Capcom remastered the first Resident Evil to critical acclaim, but how do you recapture the X factor of Resident Evil 2 in a remaster? I have no fucking clue, but they did it. They totally did it. Resident Evil 2 feels like a revitalization of the genre in a way that I never would have expected. Across almost every metric, the game succeeds, and at the end, you're left feeling like, wow, I just want to do that again. It feels like you just got off the end of a roller coaster and you kind of want to run straight back to the end of the line so you could go again. It's honestly that good. I think the first and most obvious thing to talk about is the game's visual presentation. It really is a very striking game to look at because of how beautifully designed each of its spaces are. This is a small game in terms of real estate. There's really only the police station, the city streets, the sewers, and the umbrella facility to speak of, and because the space is so limited, the amount of detail that goes into each of them is so impressive. Cluttered desks and libraries and offices and infected sewers and research complexes, and there's a huge amount of range in these environments because each of them are in different stages of decay. There's just so much to appreciate about this game's presentation here, and since I can't show you the best parts, you'll just have to trust me when I say that you'll love what it has to show you. Related to this is the cinematics, the storytelling, and the voice acting. Some of these cinematics and scripted scenes are just incredible, and with some of the best facial animations I've ever seen. I'm showing you this bit, which is from the intro cinematic of the game, but man, some of the stuff you will see later will really blow you away. Resident Evil has often felt very ham-fisted with the way it deals with grief and loss, because characters couldn't really show that pain on their face, meaning that the voice acting was really forced and overdone. It's still a little overdone here, particularly in the case of Leon, who is just not great at all. But in Resident Evil 2, you'll see how much work has gone into facial animations and the direction of cutscenes, and it's just some of the best pulpy horror you'll ever see in either games or whatever. It's top tier. Where the game truly shines is in its puzzle and level design. I think this is probably a good point to pause and explain the gameplay loop of Resident Evil, since I'm sure there's at least a few of you out there who have never played a Resident Evil before. Resident Evil is what I'd call an action puzzle game. You know those walking simulators that are really popular these days, stuff like Firewatch and Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, etc. Just imagine those games, but with zombies walking around. The objective is to progress through spaces by solving puzzles, which typically involve involves collecting one item and taking it to somewhere else, all the while trying to make sure your neck doesn't become zombie dinner. Combat is a thing, but you're actually way better off avoiding combat because zombies will typically just get back up again eventually anyway, and your ammo supply is so limited that needlessly fighting is always a bad idea. It sounds kind of boring, but it's actually not, it's actually awesome. The tension that comes from seeing a distant room on the map and knowing you're gonna have to fight tooth and nail to get there, and then fight just as hard to get back while knowing that every bullet fired is one you might need later, it creates this omnipresent tension that just elevates the entire experience. So, back to level design. Man, it's amazing. I think the first thing to say about the police station is that it feels like being on hallowed ground. This is one of the best spaces in the history of gaming, like stepping out onto Hyrule Field, or the Normandy, or Shadow Moses Island, and to see it realized in such graphical splendor definitely gave me some very strong feels. But it's the denseness of this space that makes it so compelling. There's just so many rooms to explore, and each of them pushes you either through their puzzle design or through the way that enemies have been positioned or the jump scare moments that the game likes to pepper in. You'll find maps throughout your playthrough, and I remember looking back as I left each area, just scanning each room I visited, and remembering how much it took me to get into each of those rooms, and how much took place in each of those rooms, and where each of those rooms eventually led me. I had nostalgia for these spaces mere hours after having stepped into them, and that's when you know that you've really, really nailed level design. I will say one thing though, and that's on the issue of backtracking. Now, backtracking is one of these things that I think some annoying journalist stupidly said was bad back in the day, and then for whatever reason everyone started parroting this line like, oh, backtracking equals bad, it's bad, backtrack. No. Backtracking, if it's done correctly, is actually glorious. Are you going to tell me that backtracking in Metroid is bad, or Arkham Asylum, or Metal Gear? No, backtracking in these games deepens your connection to the space. So rather than skim over gigantic tracts of meaningless square mileage, you become intimately familiar with those spaces and appreciate their nuances. There are very few games ever made that have nailed backtracking better than Resident Evil 2, and it's just the same thing here with the remaster. Still, if you're sensitive to that sort of thing and you don't like backtracking, then don't buy Resident Evil. Your loss. On the puzzles, they're really great. There's quite a few returning puzzles from the original game, but also a whole bunch of new ones as well, and they all feel really intuitive and really well designed. One of the great fears that I have as a reviewer is that one day I'll encounter a puzzle in a game like this and I won't be able to get past it, and because there's no like online walkthroughs or whatever, then I'll just be stuck and I'll be sitting there like, what do I do now? But the puzzles in Resident Evil 2 are clearly explained, they are logical and solvable so long as you apply your brain. There wasn't a single puzzle where I was like, well, that was a dumb solution. They all made sense and some of them were just brilliant. But again, I won't spoil those. Coming back to combat briefly, I think it's important to know what you're getting yourself into before you pick up a game like Resident Evil 2. This is not an action game. Combat is very slow. I'd even go as far as to call it clunky, but deliberately so. You're meant to feel awkward and exposed, and the controls create that sensation. You move slowly, your turning arc is wide, your gun reticle is very wide and imprecise unless you hold your aim for a good 2 to 3 seconds, at which point it closes and becomes more accurate. This works really well throughout your playthrough because again, you're not meant to be fighting everything, you're meant to be surviving, and this control scheme does a great job of disempowering you in just the right way. Where this doesn't work, and it's really my only criticism of the entire game, is in boss encounters. Now, I'm not going to show you any boss encounters because I don't want to spoil the boss encounters, but what you'll find when you fight bosses is that they require you to move in a very counterintuitive, unnatural way because the control scheme doesn't give you the flexibility to move in a way that you would move if you were sort of in the same situation in real life. Bosses have very wide attack arcs, and since you can't dodge or sidestep, you actually need to constantly run really far away from bosses and give them huge berths because that's the only way you can survive safely. It's not bad, but it's really not great, and while the boss encounters look so impressive and there's such awesome climactic moments, they are a little bit frustrating in a way that the rest of the game isn't. You'll sort of know what I mean if and when you play it. Doesn't kill the experience by any means, but it was certainly my least favorite part of the experience. One area that is so precise and snappy is UI design. Now, I would almost never talk about UI in a review, but the UI design in Resident Evil is honestly award-worthy. Firstly, there's no delay in your menus appearing, which I know sounds like a minor thing, but you'll be spending so much time in your menus that this is just awesome. Secondly, the map design is perhaps the best I've ever seen in a game like this. Each area of the map marks out where you've been, and it also marks out any items you've found but didn't pick up, which will happen very often because inventory space is limited. So when you're low on an item, you can actually scan your map to see if you've left any laying around, and you can go back and pick it up. Third, every area of the map is red until after you've cleared a room, which means solving the puzzle in that room and collecting every item. This makes it so easy to quickly see which areas of the map still hold some sort of value to you, which is just great. And finally, if you've collected an item and it's no longer useful to you, it puts a little check mark on it so you know it's safe to destroy it. I know this is a really small thing, but so many games don't do this, and you end up just holding onto all these items you don't need. Like, well, I need this later. Well, no, you won't need it later. It tells you it won't need it, and you can just destroy it. Related to this is the matter of inventory management. Just as combat and exploration are really core parts of the game, so too is managing your inventory. Now, it starts out really small, and it does get larger, but so too do your weapons and the number of things you need to carry at any point in time. So you never really feel like you have anywhere near enough space. You will spend so long staring at your inventory, asking what you should be carrying at any point in time. And I know a lot of people find this part of survival horror games really frustrating, but it's really core to the experience, because if you could carry everything all the time, the game wouldn't be anywhere near as tense and challenging. So keep that in mind. Your mileage may vary. What the game does, and I think it's one of the unsung components of Resident Evil games, is ration out its items in exactly the right measure to keep you progressing without flooding you or starving you. That balance is so difficult for a game to manage, and Resident Evil completely nails it. You can absolutely brick your playthrough by misusing your items, using too much ammo, too many healing items, trying to kill too many enemies, etc, etc. So for that reason, saving multiple times with multiple different save files is important, because if you're really screwed, you might have to go back like an hour or two when you had more ammo and try and play more carefully from there. But I was careful throughout my playthrough, and as such, I always had just enough items to meet each challenge, and that's just a reminder of how talented these developers are. To be able to tune a game like this that precisely takes a lot of skill, and they certainly have it. So this one part of the review is really hard to talk about, okay? I'm going to talk about it in really circumspect terms because I don't want to spoil it. And I would also say to you, be careful which other reviews you watch, because if this was spoiled for me, I would be so fucking pissed. But anyway, as a reviewer, you learn what people like and don't like. And you sort of wouldn't even think about it yourself, but you kind of like learn based on feedback and comments that, you know, there's certain touch points, certain things that really piss people off about video games. For example, a field of view slider in a PC game is really important for a lot of people because they get motion sick, and without that, they can't play the game. Or things like online connectivity for games, because a lot of people don't always have access to an internet connection. Or de novo DRM, because a lot of people want to know that they can access their purchases 20 years from now when de novo services are probably dust. One of the things I've learned while being a reviewer is that a lot of people really hate timers in games. I don't mind timers. I think that they can be a really important part of game design. Some people fucking hate timers, and they refuse to play any game with a timer. They play games to relax, and they want to take the game at their own pace, and any game that hastens them with a timer, they simply refuse to play. I point this out because a huge part of Resident Evil 2 is driven by this specific gameplay mechanic, which I won't spoil. It has been sort of shown in a number of gameplay trailers and whatever else, but I won't spoil it for you. But it's the sort of timer that forces you to do everything quickly. Personally, the inclusion of this timer was the best part of the entire game, and the shock of it and how unexpected it was and how much it just elevates an already extremely tense experience. Oh my god, it was so inspired. But I know a lot of people will really hate this feature because they don't like to be rushed. So, if you're okay with timers, no problem. But if you're sensitive to timers, you probably will not like Resident Evil 2 at all. So a few details to round out the review. The future of microtransactions in this game is unclear. There is an online store menu option, but that store isn't up yet at the time of review, so I don't know what they are selling, and Capcom hasn't explained it yet. The game has been rated to include in-game purchases, so do watch this space. Capcom are a mix of good and bad when it comes to microtransactions, with the extraordinary Monster Hunter being a brilliant example of consumer centricity, where games like Street Fighter are becoming more and more focused on microtransaction revenue. If you're sensitive to this sort of thing, be sure to hold off on your purchase until the microtransaction stuff is clear. I'll update the description of this video with information on the in-game purchases as soon as they are available. Finally, let's talk about replayability. Resident Evil 2 is split into two parts, a Leon playthrough and a Claire playthrough. You'll choose who you want to play with at the start of the game, and then you'll finish it, and then you'll start again from the other person and you'll play through with them, only it's a different playthrough. It's the same maps and areas, only everything has been rearranged so the order you do things is totally different, and new rooms become accessible and new story details emerge because you're seeing the story through someone else's eyes. It's sort of like playing Nier Automata on playthrough B, except the changes in Resident Evil 2, the gameplay changes, are far more substantial than they were in Nier Automata. Each playthrough will run you for around 6 hours the first time you do them, and I'll say that the second playthrough is hands down the best part of the game because it is even more demanding in terms of item economy, enemy population, and the impact of the omnipresent timer. All of these things are just ratcheted up, and it feels like a completely new experience, even though you're retreading familiar territory. And after you've done this playthrough, you can actually go back to do the game from the start, but the other way around. So if you've played with Leon first and then Claire, you can actually play with Claire first and then Leon. And while the gameplay and story differences here are less significant, they're definitely still worth seeing if you've really fallen in love with the game. There's also a survival mode available where you can race to escape as quickly as possible, earning a better rank every time you do so. There's no item pickups here, so it's all about making it as far as possible before your limited supply runs out. It's loud, it's intense, it's arcadey, and it's fun. Finally, I'll comment on the PC port, which is what I played. It's perfect. Admittedly, I played on an RTX 2080 Ti, but that doesn't mean shit in a lot of games, since games like Fallout can't even manage its solid 60 FPS on a card like that. I never once went below 100 frames per second, which is the max my monitor can handle. I never had a single crash. The game alt-tabs beautifully, and it supports full ultra-wide with a basic but decent set of graphical settings. Given how wonky the Monster Hunter port was, I'm glad to see Capcom have done a much better job this time around. So I feel like I've given you a fairly cold, almost sort of mechanical overview of what makes this game so great, and that's because I don't want to spoil its best parts. I hate doing reviews like this because you're so limited, but it's rare that a game is so impressive that I worry so much about spoiling its moments. Resident Evil 2 is that rare, extremely impressive experience that makes it a joy to do what I do for a living. I absolutely loved it, and it is now firmly on my Game of the Year list for 2019. There's some amazing stuff coming this year, but I'm sure that Resident Evil 2 will carve out a spot in at least the top 10, maybe top 5, and maybe for some people, number 1. It really is awesome, and if it looks like something that you would be interested in, don't hesitate, grab it. You're almost sure to love it. Thanks very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, remember to hit the like button and subscribe and notification bell. And if you really liked the video, consider supporting me on Patreon. Thanks again, and see you next time. Bye-bye.